The ghost of American industry haunted Oak Haven, Ohio. It clung to the rust on the chain-link fences and whispered through the shattered windows of the abandoned Packard plant. For Marcus Mack Washington, that ghost lived in the bones of the '68 Ford Mustang he was meticulously restoring. At 55, his hands, stained with a lifetime of grease and oil, moved with a surgeon's precision. The smell of gasoline and worn metal was the only scripture he'd ever needed. This garage was his church, a sanctuary of steel and memories, a stark contrast to the quiet, unchanging neatness of the small house he shared with his wife, Janelle. He was searching for a 7/16-inch socket when his fingers brushed against it in the pocket of Janelle's winter coat, which she'd left draped over a chair. It wasn't a stray tissue or a crumpled receipt. It was a plastic prescription bottle, cool and smooth against his calloused skin. He pulled it out, his brow furrowing. Janelle wasn't on any medication. They were healthy, or so he thought. 30 years of marriage, and their only ailment was a quiet, aching void where the laughter of children should have been. He held the bottle up to the single, dusty light bulb hanging from the ceiling. The label was crisp and white, a jarring slash of clinical purity in the grimy garage. Patient, Janelle Washington, RX-SWA 774B91. Drug, spironolactone 100 meters. He'd never heard of it. He slid his phone from his jeans, his fingers leaving oily smudges on the screen as he typed the drug's name into the search bar. The results loaded, and the garage suddenly felt cold. The first few links were for high blood pressure and heart failure. That made no sense. Janelle's heart was strong. He knew its rhythm by heart, the steady beat he'd fallen asleep to for 3 decades. But as he scrolled further, a different, more chilling use appeared. The screen glowed with the words, hormone therapy, commonly used as a testosterone blocker. The phone nearly slipped from his grasp. Testosterone blocker. The words were alien, nonsensical. It had to be a mistake, a misdiagnosis. Maybe the doctor had mixed up her chart. He imagined a bumbling pharmacist, a careless error. But deep in his gut, a cold knot of dread began to tighten. It felt like the moment a timing belt snaps on the highway. A sudden, catastrophic failure without warning. He thought of their years of trying, the invasive tests, the heartbreaking negatives, Janelle's quiet tears that he could never quite soothe. All of it. Had all of it been something else? The shrill ring of his phone cut through the silence, making him jump. It was an unknown number. He wiped his hands on a rag, the familiar gesture a small anchor in a suddenly tilting world. Mack's garage. Mr. Washington, this is Dr. Vance. The voice belonged to their family doctor of 20 years, Elias Vance. But it wasn't his usual calm, reassuring tone. It was thin, strained, like a wire pulled too tight. I need to speak with you, urgently. Doc, is everything all right? Is it Janelle? Mack's voice was sharper than he intended. She's fine. It's a private matter, and it's important we don't discuss it over the phone, and not at the clinic. A pause. There's a small park off Route 2, by the old pier overlooking the lake. Can you meet me there in an hour? Say 5 p.m., just as the sun sets? A park? The secrecy was a red flag, flapping violently in the wind of his newfound anxiety. Doctors didn't summon you to deserted parks at dusk. A park? Doc, what the hell is this about? Please, Mac. Dr. Vance's voice was almost a plea. There are things you have a right to know. Things I should have told you a long time ago. Just come alone. The line went dead. Mac stood frozen, the prescription bottle feeling like a block of ice in his palm, the doctor's strange request echoing in the cavernous silence of the garage. The polished chrome of the Mustang gleamed under the light. A perfect, beautiful lie. Outside, the sun was beginning its descent, painting the industrial haze of Oak Haven in shades of orange and blood red. He had a choice: ignore the call and confront Janelle with the bottle, or drive to the lake and face a truth so terrible their doctor was afraid to speak it within the walls of his own office. The cold knot in his stomach told him they were connected. The pills, the call, the 30 years of unanswered prayers. And he knew, with a certainty that terrified him, that his life was about to be split in two, the time before this moment and whatever came after. The drive to the lake was a blur, The familiar landscape of Oak Haven, with its boarded-up storefronts and proud, tired houses, felt alien. Each traffic light, each pothole, was a small delay, stretching the tension in his chest to a breaking point. The park was just as Dr. Vance had described, a forgotten patch of green by the shore of Lake Erie, where the gray, choppy water stretched to an indifferent horizon. A few rusted picnic tables stood sentinel on the cracked concrete, monuments to happier times. The air was cold, carrying the damp, fishy smell of the lake. Dr. Vance was waiting by the crumbling pier, a frail silhouette against the fading light. The man Mac had known for 2 decades looked as if he'd aged another 10 years since their last checkup. His expensive coat hung loosely on his shrunken frame, and his face, usually a mask of professional calm, was etched with a profound weariness. The dying sun cast long, distorted shadows, making the serene landscape feel menacing. "Mac, thank you for coming," Vance said, his voice raspy. He didn't offer a handshake. "Cut the crap, Doc! What's going on? Why are we out here?" Mac's voice was low, a rumble of contained fury. He held up the prescription bottle. "And what the hell is this?" Vance's eyes fell on the bottle, and he let out a long, shuddering sigh. It was a sound of surrender. "I have stage 4 pancreatic cancer, Mac. The doctors give me a few months, maybe less." The confession was so unexpected it momentarily stunned Mac into silence. He'd come expecting a confrontation about Janelle, not a death sentence for his doctor, but the pity was quickly eclipsed by suspicion. "What does that have to do with anything?" "It has everything to do with it," Vance said, his gaze fixed on the churning water. "A man with a deadline starts to think about his ledgers, the accounts he needs to settle, and I have a debt to you, Mac. A very, very old one." He finally looked at Mac, and his eyes were filled with a terrible ancient guilt. "You and Janelle can't have children, you know this, but you've never known the real reason why." Mac's heart hammered against his ribs. "We did the tests. They said it was unexplained infertility. You said that. You wrote the reports." "I lied," Vance whispered, the words nearly stolen by the wind. "The reports were fabrications. The tests were a charade. There was nothing unexplained about it. The reason Janelle can't conceive is because she was not born a woman." Time stopped. The cry of a distant gull, the gentle lapping of the waves, the thrum of his own blood in his ears, it all faded into a deafening roar. "What did you say?" he managed to choke out, the world narrowing to the doctor's pale, grim face. "Janelle," Dr. Vance said, his voice clearer now, as if shedding a great weight, "was born Julian Carter." The world didn't just tilt, it shattered. Mac felt the ground beneath him give way. Julian. The name was a foreign object, a shard of glass in his throat. He shook his head, a violent, disbelieving tremor. No, that's a lie, a sick joke. I've been married to her for 30 years. I would know. "How?" Vance countered, his tone gentle but firm. "Modern medicine, hormone therapy. It can be seamless, especially when the transition happens young. She has lived as a woman longer than she ever lived as a boy. To you, she has only ever been Janelle. The woman you love." The phrase, "the woman you love," was like a lit match on gasoline. "Don't you talk about love," Max snarled, taking a step forward. "This isn't love. It's a lie, a 30-year lie." The betrayal was a physical thing, a crushing weight on his chest, making it impossible to breathe. Every shared moment, every intimate touch, every whispered dream for the future was now tainted, twisted into a grotesque parody. He felt like a fool, a blind, pathetic fool. "She was terrified of losing you," Vance continued, his voice cracking. "She loved you too much to risk the truth." "So you helped her? You, our doctor, our friend?" "Yes," Vance admitted, his shoulders slumping. "And that is the debt I have to repay." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, heavy metal box, about the size of a shoebox. It was old, with a tarnished brass latch and a small, intricate lock. "Everything is in here," Vance said, holding it out. The proof, her original birth certificate, old photos, medical records from the clinic in Baltimore where it was done, her diaries from that time. I kept them for her, for safekeeping. I want you to have it. The truth is yours now. Do with it what you will." Max stared at the box as if it were a venomous snake. It was a Pandora's box of his wife's secrets, a metallic coffin holding the death of his marriage. He felt a wave of nausea. He didn't want the box. He wanted to throw it into the depths of Lake Erie and pretend this conversation never happened. He wanted to go back to his garage, to the clean, understandable world of pistons and carburetors. But there was no going back. Dr. Vance had made sure of that. The truth was out, and it was ugly, and it was demanding a reckoning. The dying sun had finally vanished, plunging the park into a deep, oppressive twilight. The metal box felt impossibly heavy in Mac's hands, its cold weight a physical manifestation of the lie he had been living. He looked from the box to Dr. Vance's face, a landscape of pity and regret in the deepening gloom. Pity. The doctor pitied him. The thought sent a fresh, searing wave of fury through him. "You falsified the tests," Mac said, his voice dangerously quiet. "For 20 years, you let us go through that hell. The appointments, the hope, the goddamn charts Janelle kept by the bed. You sat in your office, looked me in the eye, and told me to keep trying. You watched my wife cry, and you said nothing." "I was trying to protect her," Vance insisted, his voice frail against the rising wind. "And your marriage. I saw how much you loved each other. I thought the truth would destroy it." "It wasn't your place," Mac roared, the sound swallowed by the vast emptiness of the park. "It wasn't your goddamn decision to make. It was my life, my future, my right to have a family, the dream of a son, a boy he could teach to fish, to fix an engine, a legacy to carry the Washington name. It wasn't just a dream, it was the bedrock of his identity. And these two people, his wife and his doctor, had conspired to build his life on a sinkhole. I helped Janelle, Vance confessed, his voice barely a whisper. Financially, with some of the final procedures. She was alone, disowned by her family. She had no one. I felt responsible. That was it, the final betrayal. The doctor wasn't just a passive keeper of secrets. He was an active architect of the deceit, a financial backer, a patron of the lie. The image of Vance handing Janelle money, enabling this grand deception, flashed in Mac's mind, and something inside him snapped. The carefully constructed dam of a lifetime of patience and gentle strength broke, unleashing a torrent of pure, unadulterated rage. He glanced down at the toolbox he'd instinctively brought with him from the garage, a habit born of decades of being the man who could fix anything. His hand went to the lid, his fingers closing around the cold, heavy steel of a pipe wrench. It felt familiar, an extension of his own arm. He was a builder, a fixer, but right now, all he wanted to do was break something. "You took my life from me," Mac said, his voice a low, guttural growl. He took a step toward Vance, the wrench held loosely at his side. Vance saw the look in his eyes, the shift from anguish to menace. He raised his hands, a pathetic, placating gesture. "Mac, please, think about what you're doing. This won't solve anything. Janelle, don't you say her name." He didn't remember swinging. It was a blind, reflexive action, fueled by 30 years of suppressed disappointment and a moment of unbearable betrayal. There was a sickening, wet thud as the heavy wrench connected with Vance's temple. The doctor's eyes widened in a brief, final moment of surprise, and then he crumpled to the ground without a sound, a marionette with its strings cut. Silence descended, broken only by the lapping of the lake. Max stood over the body, his chest heaving, the wrench still gripped in his hand. A dark, glistening pool was already beginning to form on the cracked concrete around Vance's head. The setting sun had left a final, bloody streak across the horizon, mirroring the scene at his feet. The rage evaporated as quickly as it had come, replaced by a cold, paralyzing shock. "Oh God," he whispered, the words catching in his throat. He dropped the wrench, which clattered loudly on the ground. He knelt, his fingers trembling as he reached for Vance's neck, searching for a pulse he knew he wouldn't find. There was nothing, just the cooling skin and the stillness of death. He had killed a man. He, Mac Washington, a man who had never been in a fight in his life, who prided himself on his steady hands and calm demeanor, was a murderer. The weight of it was suffocating. He looked at his hands, no longer the tools of a craftsman, but the weapons of a killer. And in the oppressive silence of the twilight park, a new, more primal fear began to take root. The terror of a black man standing over the body of a dead white doctor in a quiet corner of Ohio. He had to run. He had to hide. He snatched the metal box from the ground, his mind racing, scrambling for a way out of the abyss he had just created. Panic is a cold fire. It burned through Mac's veins, incinerating every rational thought, leaving only the primal instinct for survival. The image of a courtroom, a white jury, the condescending look of a prosecutor, it all flashed through his mind, a nightmare reel of a story he'd seen play out 100 times before. He couldn't let them find him here. Not like this. His eyes darted around the deserted park. The nearest cover was a dense thicket of overgrown bushes and thorny vines near the edge of the woods, about 30 yards from the pier. It was a dark, uninviting tangle of nature, reclaiming its territory. Adrenaline surged through him. He grabbed Dr. Vance under the arms. The body was a dead weight, horrifyingly limp. He grunted with the effort, his muscles screaming as he dragged the corpse across the cracked concrete and damp grass, leaving a faint, dark smear in his wake. He shoved the body deep into the thicket, the thorns tearing at his jacket and scratching his hands. He worked frantically, covering Vance with loose leaves and broken branches, his breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. It was a clumsy, pathetic attempt at concealment, but it was all he could manage. He stood back, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The body was no longer visible from the path. It would have to be enough. He ran back to the spot of the murder. The dark pool of blood was a damning accusation on the concrete. He looked around wildly. The lake. He grabbed his heavy toolbox and the bloody wrench, ran to the end of the pier, and hurled them into the choppy black water. They disappeared with a barely audible splash. Next, the blood. He used a dirty rag from his pocket, scrubbing at the stain, smearing it, trying to erase his sin. It was hopeless. He needed water. He found an old, discarded plastic bottle, filled it from the lake, and poured it over the stain, scrubbing furiously with the rag until the concrete was just a dark, wet patch. He was about to leave when he remembered the metal box, Janelle's secrets, his motive. He couldn't leave it. He couldn't destroy it, not yet. He clutched it to his chest like a shield and ran to his truck, his mind spinning. He needed an alibi, a rock-solid, unshakable alibi. Tyrone, his best friend since high school. A man who understood the unspoken rules of survival in a town like Oakhaven. Mac fumbled for his phone, his bloody, scratched fingers leaving streaks on the screen. Ty, it's Mac. Man, I need a drink, a strong one. Meet me at the tap room, now. His voice was hoarse, almost unrecognizable. Mac, you sound like hell. Everything okay with Janelle? Just a bad day. Real bad. See you there. He hung up before Tyrone could ask more questions. The tap room was on the other side of town, a dimly lit, smoky haven where conversations were low and the whiskey was strong. The jarring normality of it was surreal. The jukebox was playing an old soul song. People were laughing, shooting pool. Max slid into their usual booth in the back, the metal box tucked safely on the seat beside him, hidden by his jacket. Tyrone arrived minutes later, his large frame filling the entrance. His easy smile faltered when he saw Mac's face. "Damn, brother," Tyrone said, sliding in opposite him. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Worse," Mac muttered, downing the whiskey the waitress had already brought. He signaled for another. "Trouble at home? Janelle?" At the mention of her name, a fresh wave of pain and anger washed over him. He couldn't talk about it. He couldn't even form the words. Just work. A deal went south. Lost a lot of money. It was a weak lie, but Tyrone seemed to accept it, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "We've seen worse, man. We'll figure it out." They sat for hours, Mac drinking himself into a deliberate stupor, while Tyrone tried to lift his spirits with old stories. Mac barely listened, his mind replaying the sickening thud of the wrench, the sight of Vance's lifeless eyes. He felt trapped behind a pane of glass, watching the world go on without him. Then he saw it. On the small TV mounted above the bar, a local news bulletin interrupted the basketball game. A picture of Dr. Elias Vance filled the screen. The anchor's voice was grave. "We're coming to you with breaking news. Prominent Oakhaven physician Dr. Elias Vance has been reported missing by his staff. He was last seen leaving his clinic this afternoon. His car has been found abandoned near the Lake Erie Public Park. Police are asking anyone with information to come forward. The whiskey glass slipped from Mac's fingers and shattered on the floor. Tyrone stared at him, his eyes wide with concern. "Mac, you knew him, right? That's your doctor." Mac couldn't speak. He just stared at the screen, at the smiling, professional photo of the man he had just killed. It was real. They were looking for him. And his car, found right where the murder had taken place, was a breadcrumb leading straight to the scene of the crime. The noose was already tightening. Detective Isabella "Izzy" Rossi hated cases that started at dusk. Darkness had a way of swallowing evidence and breeding secrets. She stood by Dr. Vance's abandoned silver Lexus, its polished exterior a stark contrast to the decaying park around it. The car was locked, pristine, no signs of a struggle. Her partner, Detective Miller, a burly man with a permanent cynical squint, kicked at a loose stone. "Probably just an old guy who forgot where he parked," Miller grumbled, his breath misting in the cold night air. "Or maybe he found a lady friend and didn't want the wife to know. Oh, wait, he's a widower." "His nurse said he was meeting someone here. She said he sounded agitated all day," Izzy said, her gaze sweeping the area, missing nothing. She wasn't like Miller, who saw the world in easy, cynical cliches. Izzy saw it as a puzzle, and she believed every piece mattered. "Let's talk to the nurse again in the morning. For now, seal the car, get forensics to dust it, and let's canvass the area." The next morning, the Oak Haven Police Department felt charged with an energy it rarely saw. A prominent doctor doesn't just vanish. At the clinic, the nurse, a kind-faced woman named Clara, was distraught. "He was a good man, detective," she said, wringing her hands. "Meticulous. He never missed an appointment, never left without setting the alarm." "You said he called someone before he left yesterday," Izzy prompted gently. "Yes, a patient, Mac Washington." Clara's brow furrowed. "It was strange. Dr. Vance insisted on meeting him outside the clinic. He told me to go home, that he'd lock up himself. He'd never done that before." "Mac Washington," Miller repeated, a note of recognition in his voice. He leaned toward Izzy. "Lives over on the south side, in that cluster of streets near the old foundry. You know the type." Izzy shot him a sharp look. The type is a local business owner who's been a patient of the victim for 20 years. That makes him a person of interest, not a perpetrator. The casual racism that permeated the department was a constant, low-grade irritant she had learned to navigate, but it never failed to grate. She turned back to Clara. "Was there anything unusual about Mr. Washington's file? Any ongoing issues?" "Just the infertility treatments they were trying, on and off for years. A sad situation. Dr. Vance handled their case very personally." "Can we see the file?" Clara led them to a row of neat metal filing cabinets. She ran her finger along the labels. "L. Lewis, Lincoln, Little." She stopped, her finger hovering over a gap. She pulled the drawer out further, her frown deepening. "That's impossible." "What is?" Izzy asked, stepping closer. "The Washington file is gone," Clara said, her voice a shocked whisper. "Both of them, Max and Janelle's. It was a thick file, one of our biggest. It was right here yesterday. I'm sure of it. A missing file. That wasn't a coincidence. It was a statement." Miller grunted. "See? Told you. The guy's guilty as sin. Takes the doc out, steals the evidence." "Or," Izzy countered, her mind racing, "the file contains something the killer didn't want us to see, something that might not have anything to do with Mac Washington." But her gut told her otherwise. A secret meeting, a missing file. The lines were converging on one man. They decided to search Vance's office one more time. It was as neat as the nurse had described, everything in its place. Books on a shelf, a polished desk, a photo of his late wife. Izzy ran her hand along the edge of the desk, her eyes scanning the floor. Miller was already by the door, impatient. "Nothing here? Let's go pay Mr. Washington a visit." But Izzy had stopped. Her eyes were fixed on a small object half hidden under the leg of a heavy leather armchair. It glinted in the morning light, filtering through the blinds. She knelt down, using a pen to nudge it out. It was a tiny, ornate, brass-colored key, the kind you might find on a music box or a diary. It was small enough to be easily missed, and it looked old. It didn't match the modern, standard-issue keys on Vance's keyring, which lay on the desk. "What's that?" Miller asked. "I don't know," Izzy murmured, carefully placing it in an evidence bag. "But I have a feeling it's the key to something important." She held it up. It was a small, fragile piece of metal, but it felt heavy with unspoken secrets, and she had a strong suspicion that whatever it unlocked was connected to the missing file and the man who was supposed to meet Dr. Vance by the cold, dark waters of Lake Erie. The search of the park was a frustrating, fruitless exercise. Uniformed officers walked in grids, their boots squelching in the damp earth. They found beer bottles, discarded wrappers, and a homeless man's makeshift camp, but no sign of Dr. Elias Vance. The wet patch on the pier where Mac had scrubbed the blood was noted, but without a body, it was just an anomaly. By midday, morale was low, and Miller was getting agitated. "We're wasting time, Izzy," he said, kicking a loose rock into the water. "The guy's probably in the lake. We should be calling the dive team, not playing hide-and-seek in the woods." "The lake is a big place, Miller. A body could drift for miles. The dogs give us a better chance of finding a specific scent trail on land," Izzy replied, her eyes scanning the tree line. "The nurse said he was meeting someone in the park. That means he was on foot." Miller snorted. "Dogs, great. Let's hope the perp was thoughtful enough to wear bacon-scented cologne." Izzy ignored him and made the call. An hour later, a black and white K9 unit SUV pulled up. The handler, a quiet, focused officer named Cortez, opened the rear door and Shadow emerged. The German Shepherd was a magnificent animal, all coiled energy and disciplined intelligence. His dark coat seemed to absorb the weak sunlight, and his eyes missed nothing. "What are we looking for, Detective?" Cortez asked, getting Shadow harnessed. "A body," Izzy said bluntly. "Victim is Dr. Vance. His car was over there. We believe he was attacked on or near the pier." Cortez led Shadow to the pier, letting him sniff around the area, including the damp spot. The dog whined softly, circling the spot a few times, his nose to the ground. He picked up a scent, his tail giving a slight, interested wag, and started to lead Cortez away from the pier, toward the grassy area. But the trail was weak. The wind off the lake was swirling, dispersing the scent. Shadow would follow the trail for a few yards, then lose it, circling in confusion, his nose twitching. He'd backtrack, find it again, only to lose it once more. "It's faint," Cortez said, his frustration evident. "The wind and the time delay, he's having trouble locking on." Miller crossed his arms, a smug, "I told you so" look on his face. "Told you. Waste of time." Izzy watched the dog, her focus absolute. She saw the subtle cues, the way Shadow's ears twitched, the way he kept returning to one specific patch of grass. "He keeps coming back here, Cortez. What's he telling you?" "He's telling me the scent is strongest here, but it's being scattered. It's like trying to follow a ghost in a hurricane." For nearly an hour, they continued the frustrating dance. Shadow worked tirelessly, his panting breath visible in the cool air. The other officers started to pack up their gear, convinced the effort was futile. Even Izzy was beginning to doubt her own instincts. Maybe Miller was right. Maybe the body was at the bottom of the lake. She was about to call it off when Shadow suddenly froze. His body went rigid, his ears perked, his nose pointed directly at the dense thicket of thorns and overgrown bushes at the edge of the woods. He let out a low growl, a sound that was not of confusion, but of discovery. "What is it, boy?" Cortez murmured, his hand tightening on the leash. Shadow didn't move. He just stared at the bushes. Then he let out a single, sharp, authoritative bark. "He's got something," Cortez said, his voice now charged with urgency. "He's on to something solid." Izzy and Miller rushed over. The thicket was dark and impenetrable, a wall of tangled branches. No one had bothered to search it thoroughly. It seemed too unlikely. "Get some cutters," Izzy ordered a nearby officer. As they began to hack through the dense vegetation, a foul, coppery smell hit them, the unmistakable odor of stale blood. The officers recoiled. Shadow, his job done, sat patiently, his gaze fixed on the spot. A few minutes later, they had cleared an opening, and there, half buried under a pathetic pile of leaves and branches, was a pale hand. Then, an arm in an expensive woolen coat. Detective Miller, for the first time that day, was speechless. Izzy knelt, her face grim. The search was over. Dr. Elias Vance had been found, and their missing person case had just become a homicide. As she stood up, her eyes scanned the ground around the thicket, and she saw them. Faint, almost invisible drag marks leading back toward the pier. The killer had been here. He had stood right where they were standing now, and he had left more behind than just a body. The low growl of the angle grinder was a scream in the pre-dawn stillness of Mac's garage. Sparks flew like angry fireflies, illuminating his face, which was a mask of sweat and grim determination. The metal box from Dr. Vance sat on his workbench, stubbornly resisting his efforts to unlock its secrets. He'd spent a sleepless night staring at it, the small brass lock mocking him. He didn't have the key. The only way in was through brute force. Finally, with a piercing screech, the grinder cut through the latch. The garage fell silent again, the only sound his own ragged breathing. With trembling hands, he pried open the lid. The musty smell of old paper and forgotten time filled the air. He pulled out the contents one by one, laying them on the workbench under the harsh glare of the single bulb. It was a lifetime, a whole other lifetime. There was an official-looking document, a birth certificate from Maryland. Name, Julian Marcus Carter. Sex, male. The words seemed to burn into his retinas. He dropped it as if it were on fire. Next came a stack of photographs, held together by a faded rubber band. He slid it off. The top photo was of a skinny, awkward-looking teenager with large, sad eyes and a shy smile. It was a boy's face, but the eyes, they were Janelle's. He could see her in the delicate curve of the jaw, the shape of the nose. He flipped through them. Julian at a high school graduation. Julian on a beach, looking painfully thin in swim trunks. Julian with a man and woman who must have been his parents, both of them stern-faced and unsmiling. Then he found the diaries, small, leather-bound books filled with neat, cramped handwriting. He opened one at random. They don't understand. Mom said it's a phase. Dad called it a sickness, but it's not. This body is a cage, and I don't know how to get out. He flipped to another entry, years later. The hormones are making me feel right for the first time. But I look in the mirror and still see him. I hate him. He found a small folded newspaper clipping tucked into the last diary. The headline from a Baltimore paper read, "Local youth brutally beaten in apparent hate crime." The article detailed an attack on a young man named Julian Carter, left for dead in an alley. The words anti-gay slurs and transgender slurs jumped out at him. His stomach churned. The rage that had been his constant companion for 2 days was suddenly complicated by a foreign, unwelcome emotion. A flicker of pity. A flicker of understanding of the fear she must have lived with. He was so engrossed in the contents of the box that he didn't hear the car pull up outside. He didn't hear the doors shut. The first thing he heard was the firm, authoritative knock on the front door of the house. Panic, cold and sharp, jolted him back to the present. The police. They were here. He frantically shoved the photos, the diaries, the birth certificate back into the mangled box. He had to hide it. He lifted a loose floorboard beneath his workbench, a hiding spot he'd created years ago for some extra cash, and shoved the box inside, replacing the board just as he heard Janelle's footsteps approaching the front door. He tried to compose himself, wiping the sweat from his brow with a greasy rag, his heart hammering against his ribs. He heard Janelle open the door, her voice a nervous tremor. Then, another voice, female, calm but firm. Detective Rossi. He stepped out of the garage and into the small kitchen, trying to look as if he'd just been starting his morning routine. Janelle was standing in the doorway, her face pale as a sheet. Detective Rossi and her partner, Miller, stood on the porch. Rossi's eyes, sharp and intelligent, met his. "Mr. Washington," she said, her tone even. "Good morning. I'm Detective Rossi. This is Detective Miller. I believe you were expecting us." "Expecting you?" Mac forced a confused frown. "I don't think so. Is something wrong?" "We found Dr. Vance," Rossi said, her gaze unwavering. "He was murdered. His body was found in the park where you were supposed to meet him." She let the words hang in the air, a deliberate, heavy silence. She watched him, then her eyes flicked to Janelle, who looked like she was about to faint. Rossi's gaze then drifted past Mac toward the open door of the garage. She sniffed the air subtly. "Is something burning, Mr. Washington? I smell something, like hot metal." The question hung in the air, thick and acrid as the smell of burnt metal from the garage. Mac's mind raced for a plausible lie. "Grinding down a rusted bumper this morning," he said, his voice a little too rough. "Old project. You know how it is." He forced a shrug, a gesture of casual normalcy that felt utterly fake. Detective Rosie's eyes held his for a moment longer, a silent challenge, before she nodded slowly. "We need to ask you and your wife a few questions. May we come in?" It wasn't a request. They sat in the small, immaculate living room. It was Janelle's domain, with its floral print sofa and polished family photos on the mantelpiece. Photos of them, a happy couple, at weddings, on vacations. Each one was now a testament to a lie. Mac felt a knot of bitter irony tighten in his stomach. Detective Miller took the lead, his style as subtle as a sledgehammer. "So, Mr. Washington, you told us you never made it to that meeting with Dr. Vance. Said you went for a drink with your friend Tyrone Gibbs instead." "That's right," Mac said, keeping his gaze steady. "Hard day. I just wanted to blow off some steam." "We spoke to Mr. Gibbs. He confirms your story," Miller said, leaning forward, his bulk seeming to suck the air out of the room. "But here's the thing I can't figure out. Your doctor of 20 years calls you for an urgent meeting and you just blow it off for a beer? Doesn't add up." "I was tired. I forgot." "It happens," Mac said, his hands clenched into fists in his lap, hidden from view. Izzy, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. Her voice was softer, but her questions were sharper. "Mrs. Washington," she said, turning to Janelle, who flinched at the attention. "Were you aware of this appointment?" Janelle wrung her hands. No, Mac didn't mention it. He works so hard. He gets forgetful sometimes." The lie was flimsy, her voice trembling. "And you have no idea what it could have been about?" Izzy pressed gently. "Dr. Vance's nurse mentioned your long history with infertility treatments. Perhaps an update on that?" At the mention of their barren quest for a child, Janelle's composure cracked. A single tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek. I don't know," she whispered. Mac's protective instincts, buried under layers of rage and betrayal, flared up. "Leave her out of this," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "This is between me and Dr. Vance." "Except Dr. Vance is dead," Miller shot back. "So now it's between you and us." Izzy held up a hand, silencing her partner. She looked from Mac's defiant face to Janelle's crumbling one. She saw the fear, the secrets, the decades of shared history now straining at the seams. She stood up, her movements fluid and calm. "Thank you for your time. We'll be in touch." They walked to the door. Mac felt a sliver of relief, a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. They were leaving. But just as she stepped onto the porch, Izzy paused and turned back, her expression one of thoughtful curiosity, as if a final, stray thought had just occurred to her. "One last thing, Mr. and Mrs. Washington. It's probably nothing, just a name that came up in Dr. Vance's old records. Does the name Julian Carter mean anything to either of you?" The name hit the room like a physical blow. Mac froze, his blood turning to ice. But it was Janelle's reaction that sealed their fate. She let out a small, strangled gasp, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes wide with pure, unadulterated terror, locked with Izzy's. In that one devastating moment of recognition, Janelle had confessed everything without saying a single word. Izzy Rossi held her gaze, her own eyes filled not with triumph, but with a sudden dawning understanding, and with it, a deep professional pity. She had them. The silence after the police car pulled away was heavier than any sound. The slam of the front door echoed the closing of a chapter on their lives. Mac turned to face Janelle. The mask of the defiant husband was gone, replaced by the raw, wounded face of a man betrayed. The anger was still there, a simmering volcano, but now it was mixed with the cold certainty of doom. "They know," he said, the words flat and dead. "You gave us away." "I didn't," she started, her voice a choked sob. "His name?" When she said his name, "Julian," Max spat the name out. It tasted like poison. "So it's true, all of it." Janelle collapsed onto the sofa, her body racked with sobs that seemed to come from the very depths of her soul. For 30 years, she had run from that name, built a fortress around her new life, and with one question, a detective had brought it all crashing down. Max stood over her, a towering figure of judgment. He wanted to scream, to shake her, to demand answers for the 30 years of lies. But looking at her broken form, all he felt was a vast, hollow emptiness. "Why?" he asked, the single word filled with a universe of pain. "Why, Janelle? Why would you do this to me? To us?" Slowly she looked up, her face streaked with tears and mascara. "Because I was afraid," she whispered, "and because I loved you." And then the story poured out of her. Not just the clinical facts Dr. Vance had laid out, but the raw, painful human truth. She told him about Julian, the boy who felt like a stranger in his own skin, trapped in a body that felt like a prison. She described the torment of her youth in a conservative Baltimore suburb, the constant bullying, the disgust in her own father's eyes. "He called me an abomination," she said, her voice distant, as if recounting someone else's nightmare. "My mother just prayed. They sent me to camps to fix me. When that didn't work, they threw me out." She told him about living on the streets, the desperation, the fear. And then she told him about the attack. The newspaper clipping he'd seen in the box came to life in her horrifying words. An alley, a group of men, the slurs, the fists, the boots. The feeling of her bones breaking, the taste of blood, the certainty that she was going to die right there, a forgotten boy no one wanted. "The only reason I'm alive is because of him," she said, her voice cracking. "Dr. Vance. He was a young resident at the hospital that night. He was the one who found me, who stayed with me, who fought for me when no one else would. He saved my life." Vance had become more than a doctor. He was her protector, her confidant. When she decided to fully transition, he helped her navigate the medical maze, even lending her money when her insurance refused to cover the surgeries, deeming them cosmetic. He helped her create Janelle. "When I met you," she continued, looking at Mac with an intensity he hadn't seen in years, "it was like the sun came out for the first time in my life. You saw me. Not the broken boy, not a project, but a woman. I was so terrified that if you knew the truth, you'd see the monster my father saw. You'd leave me, and I couldn't bear that. So I lied, and the lie got bigger every day for 30 years. And Dr. Vance, he kept my secret because he knew what I had run from. He wasn't trying to trick you, Mac. He was trying to protect me from a world that had tried to kill me for being who I am." Mac sank into the armchair opposite her, the weight of her words crushing him. The narrative he had built in his head, the one of a simple, selfish deception, was crumbling, replaced by a far more complex and tragic story. This wasn't just a lie about gender. It was a lie born of trauma, of violence, of a desperate fight for survival. He looked at his wife, the woman he had slept next to for 3 decades, and for the first time, he saw the ghost of the terrified boy she had once been. His rage hadn't vanished, but it was now joined by a profound, disorienting sorrow. The man he had killed wasn't just a co-conspirator. He was the savior of the woman he loved. The thought was unbearable. The sound of multiple cars pulling up outside broke the fragile truce in the room. They both knew what it meant. They had a warrant. This time, there was no pretense of a polite conversation. Detective Izzy Rossi stood on the porch, a folded document in her hand. "Mac Washington, we have a warrant to search the premises." Mac didn't protest. He just stepped aside, his movements slow and heavy, like a man sleepwalking. Janelle stood behind him, a silent, ghostly presence. The house was quickly and efficiently overrun. Uniformed officers moved through the rooms, their professionalism a stark intrusion into the intimate space of their lives. Miller, with a renewed sense of purpose, made a beeline for the garage. Izzy, however, didn't follow him. She paused in the living room, her eyes going to the mantelpiece, to the photos of the happy couple. Then she turned to Mac. "I got a court order for Dr. Vance's personal effects from his home," she said quietly. "He kept a diary. The last entry was about you. He wrote that he was going to tell you the truth about Janelle. He said he couldn't live with the lie anymore, especially with his diagnosis. He knew you'd both hate him for it, but he felt you had a right to know." Mac closed his eyes. So Vance's confession hadn't been an act of random cruelty. It had been a dying man's attempt at absolution. "Detective!" Miller's voice boomed from outside. "You're gonna want to see this." Izzy and Mac walked out to the backyard. Miller was standing by the trash cans, a triumphant look on his face. He pointed. "The garbage truck doesn't come until Friday. Look what I found." Inside one of the cans was a layer of wet, gray ash. "Get CSU out here now," Izzy ordered into her radio. "I want every particle of this sifted." The arrival of the K-9 unit was almost an afterthought, but Izzy was thorough. "Cortez, let Shadow do a sweep of the garage, anything and everything." The German Shepherd entered the garage, his nose working overtime, sniffing the air, the floor, the tools. He moved with a confident purpose, his training taking over. He circled the main workbench, whined softly, and then began to paw insistently at one specific spot on the wooden floor. "What is it, boy?" Cortez murmured. The dog pawed again, more forcefully this time, and looked back at his handler. Miller knelt down. "Loose floorboard." He pried it up with a crowbar, and there, nestled in the dark space below, was the scorched and mangled metal box. Izzy looked at Mac. His face was a stoic mask, but his shoulders slumped in defeat. It was over. As the crime scene unit processed the box and its contents, Izzy noticed something else. The small, ornate brass key she had found in Dr. Vance's office. She took the evidence bag out of her pocket. On a hunch, she walked over to the box. The key slid perfectly into the broken, misshapen lock. It was a perfect fit. Vance must have dropped it when he was attacked, but the final damning piece of evidence came from Shadow. After finding the box, he continued his search, his nose twitching over the rows of tools hanging on the pegboard. He stopped in front of a heavy pipe wrench, letting out a low, focused growl. "He's alerting on this," Cortez said. To the naked eye, the wrench was clean, but under the bright light of a forensic lamp and a spray of luminol, a faint, ghostly blue glow appeared along the heavy jaw of the tool, the unmistakable chemical signature of cleaned-up blood. Izzy turned to Mac. "Mac Washington," she said, her voice formal but not unkind. "You are under arrest for the murder of Dr. Elias Vance. You have the right to remain silent." Mac didn't resist as Miller cuffed him. He didn't say a word. He just looked at Janelle, who was standing in the doorway of their home, her hand covering her mouth, tears streaming down her face. His eyes weren't filled with anger anymore, just a deep, bottomless well of sorrow and love. It was the last look they would share as free people. The trial of Mac Washington captivated Oak Haven. It was a story that had everything: a respected doctor, a brutal murder, and at its heart, a secret that challenged the town's deeply ingrained notions of love, marriage, and identity. The courtroom was a pressure cooker of whispers, judgments, and a morbid curiosity that transcended the usual small-town gossip. Mac's lawyer argued for a lesser charge of manslaughter, painting a vivid picture of a man pushed beyond his emotional limits. He described 30 years of a lie, the sudden, brutal revelation, and the confession from Dr. Vance that he had been an architect of the deceit. It was a crime of passion, he argued, a momentary tragic snap in an otherwise good and gentle man. But the trial's most powerful moment came when Janelle took the stand. Dressed in a simple black dress, she looked fragile but resolute. In a quiet, steady voice, she told the jury everything. She told them about Julian, about the violence, about the fear, about the desperate yearning to simply be herself. She spoke of Dr. Vance not as a liar, but as a savior. And she spoke of Mac not as a monster, but as the only man who had ever made her feel truly seen, and whose love she had been too terrified to risk losing. "I am the one who is guilty," she said, her eyes finding Mac's across the crowded courtroom. "I am guilty of fear. I am guilty of not trusting the man I love with the whole of who I am. He is on trial for what he did in one moment. I have been lying for 30 years. Whose crime is greater?" Her testimony shifted the air in the room. The whispers died down. The hard, judgmental faces in the jury box softened with a flicker of complex emotion, pity, confusion, perhaps even a sliver of understanding. In the end, the jury found Mac guilty, but not of murder. They convicted him of voluntary manslaughter. The sentence was lighter than the prosecution had demanded, 7 to 10 years. A lifetime, but not the end of his life. The final scene of the public drama was not in the courtroom, but in the sterile, gray visiting room of the Oak Haven Correctional Facility a few months later. Mac, in a drab prison jumpsuit, sat opposite Janelle. The thick pane of plexiglass between them was a physical representation of the barriers they now faced. "Hi," she said, her voice small through the crackling speaker. "Hi," he replied. They sat in silence for a long moment, the years of shared intimacy a ghost in the space between them. "I'm so sorry, Mac," she finally whispered, "for everything." "I know," he said. He looked at her, truly looked at her. He saw the woman he had loved for 3 decades, but he also saw the shadows of Julian, the survivor, the keeper of secrets. They were one and the same. "You know," he said slowly, "the hardest part wasn't finding out you were born a boy. The hardest part was finding out you didn't trust me, that you thought my love was so shallow it couldn't handle the truth." Tears welled in Janelle's eyes. "I know, and I will spend the rest of my life regretting that." "I'll be out of here one day," he said, more to himself than to her. "I don't know what happens then. I don't know if we can fix this." He gestured vaguely at the glass, at their shattered lives. "I'll be here," she said, her voice firm. "I'm not running anymore. I'll be waiting, if you'll have me." He looked at her hand, pressed against the cold glass. After a moment's hesitation, he raised his own and placed it opposite hers. Their fingers didn't touch, but for the first time since that fateful evening at the lake, they were connected. The story of Mac and Janelle Washington became a cautionary tale in Oak Haven, a lesson whispered over coffee and across fences. It was a story about how secrets, even those forged in love and fear, have the corrosive power to destroy. But for the 2 people at its center, it was something more. It was a brutal, painful testament to the fact that truth is always a reckoning. It forces an accounting of the past and a reevaluation of the future. The path ahead for them was uncertain, shadowed by prison walls and years of lies. But in that sterile visiting room, with their hands pressed against the glass, a new fragile truth began to form. Their love, tested by deception and shattered by violence, was complex and broken. But it was real. And sometimes, for a future to be born, the past first has to be burned to ashes.